Our next panel discussion, this is a very under-discussed but really critical issue. It's the impact of war on religious freedom. And this is, as we are in an era of endless wars, this is really something that needs a lot of discussion and examination, and we're happy to be able to do that today. This panel is going to be moderated by my colleague, the Executive Director of the American Conservative, Johnny Burka, and to quote the immortal words of the late, great Ed McMahon, here's Johnny.
Thanks so much, Jim. Great. Well, I'd like to welcome you all to our second panel. I'm truly honored and humbled to be with such an esteemed group of panelists who have thought so deeply about this issue and done excellent work both in the past and in the present on this important topic. And before we get started, I'd also like to thank the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy for the work they do every month, convening people together, policymakers on the Hill, to talk about the impact of war on a host of issues, from the impact of war on women, like you've discussed in the past, to the impact of war on the environment, the economy, and veterans, with the aim of promoting a more peaceful and constitutional approach to U.S. foreign policy. So I'm hoping that today's discussion, after each person has a chance to present, can take a look at what America is doing well and what we're doing poorly throughout the world, particularly as it relates to religious liberty. So today's conversation will span a few different areas. We'll look at different regions throughout the world, from the situation in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, going down to Africa with a particular focus on Nigeria, over to Southeast Asia and Burma, as well as Iraq and the Middle East. But we'll also look at it through the cultural and historical dimensions and get to hear a little bit about the personal experience of the Pt2Committee community. So the format for this second panel, each panelist will have approximately 10 to 15 minutes to present from the podium on the work that they've been doing, and then we'll come together for a discussion. So we'll kick things off with Pastor Heinrich Arnold. He serves as senior pastor for the Pt2Committee in the United States and abroad, a contributing writer to Plow Quarterly. He has spoken in countries around the world on forgiveness and nonviolence, and has been active supporting international education and healthcare initiatives in partnership with Save the Children, Samaritan's Purse, and World Vision. Please welcome Pastor Heinrich Arnold to the podium.
Thank you, Johnny, and good morning, everybody. It's really an honor to be here today and to talk about this very important issue of religious freedom. And we heard in our last panel the importance of preserving cultural heritage of religion in the world and holy sites, and that really is important. And being a pastor, I don't really have a lot of academic expertise or foreign policy expertise, but one thing I do want to talk about is the importance of freedom as a spiritual thing, as living faith, how it's important to preserve that, and the ability to act and live out our beliefs in society, and how that makes countries flourish. And so that's really the context I want to talk in today. So we know that there's really a battle for allegiance at stake here, especially at times of war. So countries battle for the allegiance of their citizens, their armies, their culture, and before missiles or guns are shot, there's this battle waging for the loyalty of the hearts and minds of people. So that's why people of faith who put their ultimate trust or loyalty to God or to a higher power experience increased persecution in times of war. It's happened again and again in history. So it shows us that, history shows us that religious freedom, along with truth, are the first casualties of war. It's kind of like this canary dying in the mines from the noxious gas of war. So war brings death and suffering and persecution, and we all hate war. Everybody hates war. Let's think a bit about what the opposite of war is. It's peace and love. And what is that, and where does it come from? I think it's a virtue that's beyond pacifism, that's beyond opposition to war. It's really, from my perspective of faith, it's the heart of God. That's what peace is. It's the heart of Jesus. Like Jesus promised in the Gospel of John, peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I do not give you peace as the world gives peace. So peace isn't a passive state, but it's really a living acting, building love that builds family and community and society. So I often ask people, where does this original plan for peace or nonviolence or opposition to war come from? Does it come from the Old Testament or the New Testament? And I think many people say, oh, that's Jesus, that's the New Testament, turn the other cheek. But no, God's plan for peace goes right back to the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis. God created the world, and he said, man, go out and flourish and create family. And then what happened? The first incidence of violence was Cain, who killed his brother Abel out of envy. And God said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is calling to me from the ground. So there's that blood as a symbol of life calling to God from the ground. God was condemning war. He was saying that, yes, you are made in the image of God, and when there is shedding of blood, that defiles the image of God. So going on from there, Jesus, of course, he was the peacemaker. He said, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And so what is peacemaking? Of course, we can make peace by being strong, by standing up for justice, right? And wars are often fought in the name of making peace, as well as other foreign policy. That's fine and that's good. Others sincerely believe that following Jesus means countering violence with love and non-resistance, and doing good to your enemies, and doing good to those who persecute you. And that's really the kind of peacemaking that Jesus witnessed to in his life. Now, the first followers of the Christians, the early Christian church, they lived a life of peace and justice, and they shared their possessions, and they rejected using force and violence. One of the early, I think, 2nd century apologists, Aristides, said, whatever Christians would not wish others to do to them, the golden rule, they do not do to others. And they comfort their oppressor. They comfort their oppressors and make them their friends. They do good to their enemies. Through love towards their oppressors, they persuade them to become Christians. So for this conviction, of course, many of these early Christians were persecuted by the Roman state. And why? Because they gave their ultimate loyalty to God rather than to Caesar. So then if you look through church history, of course, after Constantine, the church was more associated with the state, and there was that connection that grew throughout the Middle Ages, and it took until about the 16th century where there was this Reformation, right? The magisterial Reformation didn't change a whole lot. They changed some of the articles of faith, but there was a group there, the Radical Reformation, that broke away on matters of conscience. And one of these groups, the Anabaptists, they professed a literal interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount from Jesus, which precluded taking oaths, participating in military action, and participating in government. One of the early leaders of this group, Conrad Grebel, he wrote this in 1524, "True Christian believers are sheep among wolves, sheep for the slaughter. Neither do they use the worldly sword or war, since all killing has ceased with them." So these early church Anabaptists, they witnessed to freedom of religion. They were one of the lone champions of that in that period of history. And they also were, I think, the first group that really testified to the separation of church and state, which of course was a founding concept for our country. At that time it was unheard of. And for this belief that cost them their social standing, often their livelihood, and even persecution to the point of death. So coming forward, there was a group of these Anabaptists that settled in this country for the sake of religious freedom, including the Mennonites, the Brethren, and a group called the Hutterites that traced back to the Anabaptists. And they had continued living in full community, sharing their resources and keeping their faith. So they emigrated here in the 19th century. Around the time of World War I, the members of the Hutterites, along with some other people of faith, refused to serve the military. So there were actually quite a few of them were put in jail. There was no way to get around that at that point. And there were four brothers from the Hutterites. His names were Joseph and Michael Hofer and another Joseph Whipf. And they were put in Leavenworth prison in 1918. And they were severely mistreated because of their faiths, because not only did they not want to fight the war, but they refused to put on the uniform and they refused to do any work. So two of them died in prison because of mistreatment. And after that, before World War II, around 1940, because of the lobby of many churches, our country our Congress passed a bill that now would allow for conscientious objection to serving in the war and rather giving an alternative service of something of national importance that could be done in times of war when there was a draft. So there were thousands of people that served this country doing alternative service during World War II. They did things like building dams and roads and fighting forest fires and good work like that, working in hospitals. So now I'd like to tell our own story from the Bruderhof, from my own personal and church heritage. The Bruderhof was founded by my great-grandfather, Eberhard Arnold, his wife Emmy, in Germany, and that was 1920, in the aftermath of World War I. Now, he had been studying for theology and a PhD in theology and philosophy. He was a popular speaker and writer, and the war came along, so he was conscripted, as all young men were at that time, and went to the front of World War I and suffered ill health, and so was discharged. And then since he was going into the ministry, he volunteered to pastor to the soldiers that were returning wounded from the battles, from the trenches. And the amount of suffering, the pain he saw, the injustice he saw, he realized that war is terrible, war is wrong, and felt that as a Christian he could no longer participate in war. And this kind of got him thinking, what do I do with our lives? How do we witness to faith in daily life? And he decided to start this small church called the Bruderhof as an alternative to capitalism, militarism, and power politics. So here's something he wrote in 1920. He said, "We do not judge those who make use of violence, but we want to serve the spirit of love, which will one day supersede all force. Driven by the living Spirit of Christ, we vow our allegiance to the kingdom of love and friendship. We resolve to join in working for the transformation of society and for forging bonds of peace between all nations." So shortly after that, here's a connection to the Hutterites and the Anabaptists. He was looking for a group that would have a similar theology, and he traveled to Canada, the United States, in 1930, and became an ordained minister of the Hutterite Church, and then continued on in Germany there. Well, with the rise of the National Socialist regime and Hitler coming to power, they very quickly came into conflict with the Bruderhof Church, and he was pretty outspoken alongside of other people at that time, such as Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Karl Barth, his personal friend. And he wrote and talked extensively early on, like prior to really the taking over of the power in Germany. Here's one thing he wrote to Nazi officials, and he addressed it to Adolf Hitler in 1933. He said, "We respect your task, your mandate. We do recognize it. You are the government we have to acknowledge. However, there is a higher mandate to place the service of perfect love, the service of community, of unity, right in the midst of disruption. And in this sense, we want to appeal to you. Allow us to live in this country governed by you, as a church which has a quite different mandate, namely, to represent the ultimate meaning and pointing to, over and against, your governmental authority, as well as your jurisdiction. You men of government, you must receive this in your hearts, so that this goal may not vanish from your hearts. Therefore, allow the communities that live in this way, and on the basis reject private property, juridical action, and the use of armed violence, to live in this land. It will be beneficial to this country." So he spoke out quite clearly. Well, it's quite predictable, too, that what happened, because he didn't bow to the Caesar of the time, the persecution increased. And in 1933, the Gestapo police raided the community, searched them for weapons, thought they were communists. By the grace of God, they were allowed to continue going at that point, but eventually they were closed down and chased out of the country in 1937 when they confiscated, the Gestapo came again, confiscated all the properties, and probably would have hauled them off to concentration camp had there not been two Hutterite ministers visiting them from the United States. And at that point, the Nazis weren't ready to be perceived evilly by this country, and so they allowed them to leave as a group, and they fled. Now, prior to that, actually, my great-grandfather, Eberhard, had died in a hospital. He was quite outspoken, and apparently in his delirium the night or two before he died, he shouted out across the hospital, "Has Goebbels repented yet?" So you can guess what may or may not have happened. We don't actually know. So anyways, that's the history of our church, and I won't continue on with that. We ended up here in this country and other parts of the world as well. But what's interesting is we all know how the persecution of Christians now has increased. I mean, there's this recent report from Bishop Truro, the independent review for the British Foreign Secretary that came out a couple days ago. And that's actually shocking to hear all the persecution that's happening, and we'll be hearing more of that from the rest of the panel who know about that in more detail. Like the recent Easter church bombings in Sri Lanka and the anti-blasphemy laws in Pakistan, anti-conversion laws in India, and many parts of the global south. There's so much persecution. And then there's other parts of the world, the Western world, where maybe there's not persecution, but there's increased suppression of true faith and of living out faith. And I think that's so important that we speak out to that and testify that all faiths should be held in esteem, and that really will strengthen society, not weaken it. So flourishing of society, family, community is dependent on freedom. And I would say that religious freedom, the freedom to believe, to live out faith and conscience, is the linchpin of all freedoms. And states that respect this right are robust and strong leaders in a free world. And war does have a devastating effect on religious freedom. So if we treasure the right to believe, to speak about and live out our faith publicly, we should do all we can to abolish war, to prevent the slide of conflict into war. And a Christian has a special mandate, and that is to love our enemy and to do good to those who persecute us. And historically, faithful Christians, as well as other religious people, have posed a threat to absolute authoritarian governments in their allegiance to God and faith over the state. So faith, in particular living Christian faith in Jesus, will challenge and provide a voice of conscience to society, but it does not threaten the just authority of governance. Religious freedom can and should strengthen the foundation of a free and democratic government, and should be supported and nurtured here in the United States and in every free society and nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heinrich. Our next speaker will be Cole Durham. He is the director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies and a law professor at BYU. He has published widely on comparative law and served as chair of both the comparative law section and the law and religion section of the American Association of Law Schools. He is the member of several advisory boards dealing with religious freedom and church-state relations. Please welcome Cole.
I was invited to the podium, but I can't see far enough to, so I'm going to stay closer to my text here, if you'll bear with me. Hobbes famously described peace as a residue left after subtracting out all times of war. He said, "The nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto, during all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. All other time is peace." If you follow that, there's not very much time left for peace. In polarized times such as ours, this suggests that in reality, warfare is the prevailing state of existence. Certainly conflict is. And so for my presentation today, this suggests that I have considerable latitude in the range of circumstances that I can count in analyzing the impact of war on freedom of religion or belief. Historically, the right to freedom of religion or belief in its modern form initially emerged from the cauldron of religious warfare at the time of the Reformation. Indeed, one can easily claim that a principal impact of war on freedom of religion or belief is that war gave birth to freedom of religion. At least one seminal thinker such as John Locke recognized that it is not religion, but oppression of religion that tended to spawn conflict. It's also important to note a vital aspect of freedom of religion, at least under international law. It's a non-derogable right. That is in contrast to other rights such as freedom of expression and freedom of association. Freedom of religion or belief is not derogable even in times of publicly declared national emergencies. Non-derogability is important not only because it's vital for human beings to be able to draw on religion at times of crisis, but it's also vital for distilling peace out of conflict. And that, I think, is part of, these considerations are part of why it's a non-derogable right. Non-derogability doesn't mean that there are limits to freedom of religion. There are. But even in emergency situations, those limits have to be narrowly drawn. Now, too often the passions of war override the constraints of non-derogability and indeed the general constraints on limitation of freedom of religion or belief, thereby compounding the tragedy of war and vastly complicating the processes of restoring peace. It's not surprising that warfare often results in violations of religious freedom rights. What is more concerning is that war in the more general Hobbesian sense of conflict falling short of hot war can nonetheless start the downward spiral into increased tensions, compounded resentments, discrimination, and ultimately social or political violence. With that in mind, I want to concentrate in my time not so much on the obvious ways that hot war results in religious freedom violations, but on some of the less violent but more prevalent conflict situations that Hobbes might count as war because they are less than peace. Now, at the beginning, and this is really in a way a backdrop and was implicit in the prior panel, the starting point is that there is a well-established right to establish and maintain places of worship, to maintain sacred space. I'm not going to go into this. There are a lot of international declarations, etc. It's interesting that while this principle is implicit in the basic international documents, the Bill of Rights, the UDHR, the ICCPR, and so forth, it wasn't until the 1981 UN Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and Discrimination Based on Religion or Belief, well, most of us call it just the 1981 Declaration, you can see why, that's when it was first explicitly articulated that there is a right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief that includes the right to worship or assemble in connection with a religion or belief, and to establish and maintain places for these purposes. And there's a lot of other things that I've written more about, but I'm not going to give you the full details, but you get the point. This is a well-established right. Despite the clarity of the right to establish and maintain places of worship under international law, cases of violation of this right abound, and that's what we've been talking about this morning and throughout this past week. In recent years, accounts of numerous types of interference with this right are all too common. I remember seeing bulldozed places of worship and homes of believers in Kazakhstan. Discrimination against unpopular religious groups is a recurring problem at the local level, practically everywhere, if only in difficulty getting land use approvals for building places that become people's places of worship. Now, instead of attempting a comprehensive review of such cases from around the world, I want to focus on some representative issues from Russia and Ukraine. The cases are representative of different types of problems with respect to sacred space, and I couldn't help thinking as I listened to the prior panel, I wish I could just sort of identify these types of problems and then let them talk about the full richness and complexity of dealing with these issues. But you will get some sense. But 4 types of situations: protecting sacred space from sacrilege, restitution of previously expropriated property, the closing of sacred space, and resolving conflicts with regard to sacred space. So, first type of situation, sacrilege, is represented by the Russian government's handling of the Pussy Riot case. It's very famous, I'm sure most of you have heard of that. And it's controversial because it pits the rights of freedom of expression against the rights of a religious community. The Pussy Riot rock group staged an unauthorized and provocative, what they called a guerrilla performance inside Moscow's Christ the Redeemer Cathedral. If any of you have been in Moscow, you know how central and large it knew. It's a building that was built on a place that had been destroyed during the communist regime. The Orthodox Church claimed the performance constituted sacrilege, and Putin agreed, and you can guess where the story went from there. The result was that the group leaders were convicted of hooliganism motivated by hate speech. They took appeals to the Court of Human Rights. I think they got out because of the Sochi Olympics. Anyway, that was basically what happened. Now, this case is obviously rooted in intentionally offensive and polarizing behavior. One can ask some questions about the harshness of the punishment, but in a certain sense, religious groups have a right to have their sacred space, and even if other groups want to speak against them, there's some intense right. Sacrilege can be a kind of warfare, after all, and there should be protections against it. Next case, this involves the restitution of, this is a restitution of religious property case. So we talked about some of those and the complexity of restitution situations. Here I just mentioned the restitution of St. Isaac's Cathedral, the Golden Dome symbol of St. Petersburg. The current building was completed in 1858. The original church built on this site that dates back to Peter the Great. It was converted into the Museum of the History of Religion and Atheism in typical communist fashion during the Soviet era. Recently, the mayor of St. Petersburg has agreed to give the building back to the Orthodox Church. Protesters contend that it's become a monument first and a church second. And I just want to highlight that conflict. The conflict between the museum value of the sacred site and the worship value of the sacred site. And one of the ways out of some of the conflicts is to transform the meaning of a place. We've talked more richly, I think, in the press session about that kind of problem. But I think that's one of the concerns that somehow in the process of conflict, the worship value of these sites, the spiritual meaning value, gets overshadowed by larger public concerns about history. Not to say that these other concerns aren't also there and valid, but somehow it seems odd for the museum value to eclipse the worship value. And I think care has to be taken about that. Okay, third issue, the war against extremism, global battle, countering violent extremism, etc. The case I want to take here is the treatment received by Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. This is not a matter about protecting sacred space, it's a matter of shutting down sacred space. Most of you would be familiar with what's happened, but it demonstrates the risks implicit in the war on religious extremism, particularly where overly broad laws are implemented by overzealous officials. Jehovah's Witnesses are known for a variety of religious views, including strong commitment to sharing their witness with others, opposition to blood transfusions, conscientious objection to participating in the military, and frankly, objection to participating in most forms of engagement with the state, except suing the state under appropriate circumstances. And most of us are grateful for the lawsuits in various countries that help pave the way for religious freedom for the rest of us. In any event, they're basically known for being peaceful and nonviolent, and given that reality, it came as a considerable shock when the Russian Supreme Court affirmed the dissolution of their central religious organization and its 395 local chapters, victimizing this group by depriving it of legal entity status on the basis of misguided findings of extremism represents a blatant violation of the right of freedom of religion or belief. Now, this story unfolded in a number of stages, and I think it's worth taking a moment to just think of the stages of how this happens, because one has to be worried about this kind of slippery slope. I can tell you other groups in Russia are very worried that this steps might start unfolding against them. A first step was to exploit an overly broad anti-extremism law. The Jehovah's Witnesses' New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures was banned as extremist, despite a law prohibiting banning copies or quotations from the Bible as extremist. I haven't spent a lot of time in their particular translation of the Bible, but you know, there are a lot of translations, and I'm just confident that it's not more extreme than any of the others. The local court held that the New World Translation of the Bible was not a Bible, and thus not protected by the law that protected Bibles. A variety of other standard publications of the Jehovah's Witnesses have been deemed extremist. Once literature was deemed extremist, it could be confiscated, and dissemination of extremist materials became a criminal offense. Another element in the legal arsenal invoked against the Jehovah's Witnesses was the so-called Yarovaya laws, named after Irina Yarovaya, chairperson of the State Duma Committee on Security, who spearheaded its passage in 2016. These laws introduced provisions prohibiting, among other things, proselytization outside of religious buildings belonging to the missionaries' organization. Engaging in religious teaching in people's homes, for example, was banned. Given Jehovah's Witnesses' commitment to sharing their beliefs, these laws constituted essentially a legal trap that they were bound to fall into. It's not clear whether the convictions that started cropping up around the country were a centrally orchestrated pattern of prosecution or merely an indication of systematic biases in local enforcement agencies across Russia. I've had friends tell me that police get together to figure out how they can up their conviction rates, and if you figure out how to convict a Jehovah's Witness in one city, you do the same thing in another. But who knows how this all works out. In either case, the pattern is concerning. It consists of a series of seemingly disconnected steps. The first step takes the advantage of Russia's vague anti-extremism law to brand various pieces of a group's literature as extreme. The court in Russia noted that 95 Jehovah's Witnesses publications were registered in the Federal Registry of Extremist Materials. I don't know how many of you have picked up a copy of Awake magazine at some point in your life. I have a hard time imagining it really being extremist, but of course, once the courts have said it is, the upper courts don't have to go back and review the validity of the decision. They just say there were a lot of different cases, and okay. So anyway, you get the problem there. I think I won't. I'm running out of time, so I won't get. Let me skip the last example. Warfare linked to property disputes. One of the most famous cases in American religion-state law emerged in the height of the Cold War tensions in the early 1950s. As background, it's important to recall that this was a time of intense fears of Soviet communism that led to the excesses of the McCarthy era. The case involved a dispute concerning St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City. Russian expatriates in New York succeeded in getting the New York legislature to pass a law that transferred title to the church from the Moscow Patriarchate, with its seat in Moscow, to the expatriate Russian group that was now living in New York. Despite the strongly anti-communist temper of the times and fears subsequently vindicated that the Moscow church had been infiltrated by the communists, the U.S. Supreme Court held that in resolving this dispute, it was obligated to defer the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, I mention this case first because it has strong parallels to what's going on today in Ukraine. Following the Russian invasion of Crimea, there has been a consolidation of Ukrainian Orthodox churches. I'm not sure how fully the consolidation has gone. Some of you can enlighten me more about how that has been working out. Earlier this year, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law, like the New York law, that makes it easier for a congregation that has hitherto been affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate to shift its allegiance to the Ukrainian Orthodox body that is in the process of emerging. There are others here who are more conversant with how this all works out theologically, but it's clear the members of one religious group have a right to change allegiance. That's not in dispute. The question is whether they can automatically take the property with them. And that is a recurrent kind of problem in all kinds of church property disputes. And I guess I'm inclined to think that our Supreme Court got this one right, but it's a complicated issue and one that we can take up. But I'm going to stop because of time.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Nadine Mayenza. She's the founding executive director of Patriot Voices, which was also co-founded by Senator Santorum, where she has provided her expertise to shape the organization's special emphasis on public policies to help working families. She's written on various policy topics that have been widely read and published in National Review, The Hill, The Daily Signal, and The Christian Post. Please welcome Nadine.
Thank you so much. And I was honored to be appointed as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom a year ago by President Trump, and my colleague here, Christina Arriaga, is also a commissioner along with me. And I did want to talk a little bit, I see some new faces here, so I know most of you are pretty familiar with the commission. I won't spend a whole lot of time, but for those of you that are not, we were established 20 years ago by Congress to be a watchdog agency for the United States. So what we do is we monitor religious freedom conditions abroad and then make recommendations to the President, to the Secretary of State, and to Congress on how we can move countries towards religious freedom. So unlike the State Department, which must look at the bilateral relationship with a country when they're interacting, we are laser focused on religious freedom. So we can keep everyone accountable that regardless of what's going on or how important an ally is, what are their conditions on religious freedom, and we call them out and we make recommendations, we do hearings, we do a lot of things to try to keep us honest in terms of religious freedom. We both do a lot of trips, delegations. We go to countries, we assess what's going on in those countries. I just a few weeks ago was in Burma and then was able to go to Bangladesh and actually went to Burma with USERF, which is the U.S. Commission's acronym, if I say that. We're talking about the Commission, and also in my own capacity afterwards went ahead to Cox's Bazar to visit some of the refugee camps there and meet some of the victims there because I wanted a full picture of the situation in Burma. While I'm not an expert on the impact of war on religious freedom, I certainly noticed the difference that war or armed conflict had on Burma and the difference around the country. And I want to thank the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy for shining a light on this important topic, because looking at Burma through these lenses is actually pretty interesting. It was remarkable to me how many people in our government we've met with that made the case that this was not a religious conflict. The conflict between the military, just so if you're not unfamiliar with Burma, there's a lot of ethnic conflicts in the different areas that's been going on. For 60 years, Burma was run by the military, and they've been transitioning to a part military, part civilian-led government. And there's still ethnic armed conflicts all through the country. In the ethnic areas. And so, we heard a lot that it's not, and we really feel like it's both. It is ethnic, of course, but you can't take the religious part out of it. The Rohingyas are Rohingya Muslims, the Kachin are Kachin Christians. And when you're talking to them, they talk about their neighbors as saying the Buddhists. So when you can't really ignore the identification or the self-identification from the religious perspective. But regardless of who agrees on that or not, we all agree that this has made a big impact on the ability to practice your faith in these communities. At times, a conflict has interfered with or diminished the ability to practice their faith. Several parts of the country's religious leaders have been attacked or houses of worship damaged and destroyed. So these are known facts. Some may claim that the physical damage or destruction of houses does not prevent someone from practicing their faith. That may be so, but we all know that freedom of religion or belief protects the ability to practice alone or in community with others. So if there isn't a church, then that's important. Moreover, many of these religious sites are of important historical and cultural significance to their communities and the surrounding areas. The conflict has put the church-run charitable organizations and other faith-based groups at great risk. They've strived to keep up with the never-ending humanitarian needs of the civilian population impacted by these decades-long violence. When the military's regular blockades on humanitarian assistance have restricted civilians' access to food, shelter, healthcare, these religious organizations have stepped in. And fortunately, the ministerial was able to shine light on several of these instances around the world. I spoke with dozens of Rohingya Muslims in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, where currently there's 1 million Rohingyas residing in slum-type settings. It didn't matter where they lived in the Rakhine state. They seemed to tell me this similar story. On August 25th, 2017, at 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning, the military led attacks on their villages. Almost everyone I talked to, and it was astounding to go through my notes, had a loved one killed during those few days. A husband, wife, daughter, son, parents, aunt, uncle. And as you know, rape was used as a weapon, and the amount of girls and women victimized was astounding. So 700,000 people fled in just a few days to neighboring Bangladesh. What I had not expected to hear was the most emotional group I met with was imams that were the only group that probably cried. And they talked about how they were attacked first, how the mosque and the Qurans were desecrated before they were burnt, that they were all burnt to the ground, and then the mosques were razed so they couldn't even easily rebuild. I heard about helicopters, which I'd never heard before, helicopters coming and shooting fire to start everything on fire to get the villages burning quicker. But the real story was how their rights have eroded throughout the years, and it was really because they used it as conflict. Oh, extremism, we're afraid of these people, so we've got to start taking their rights away. And so in 2012, they made a rule where only 5 could go to the mosque and practice together. And then if more did, they'd be arrested or even worse. Children were unable to go to madrasas. Freedom of movement was curtailed. A curfew was instituted. And also meant the call for prayer, instead of 5 times a day, could only be 3 times a day. And then right after that, they could no longer amplify the call to prayer. And then random violence, just to go into a school, and I heard lots of quotes of they just go into school and kill the religious teacher and leave. And the fear would go over and everyone would go back to their homes. So, it was obviously a lot of you are probably more familiar even with how terrible the situation has been. There were also other ethnic, not at the level of what happened to the Rakhine Muslims, but in 2018, local mobs that included Buddhist monks physically assaulted Christian pastors and parishioners in the state. In at least one instance, Christians were too afraid to safely attend church for quite a few months. And in the Kachin state, the military has long targeted houses of worship and religious leaders, accusing them of working with ethnic armed organizations. So the whole impact of the armed conflicts there's so much tension among the different religions. And in the Kachin, in the northern Shan state, more than 100,000 remain internally displaced now in camps due to the long-standing fighting. And since the 2001 collapse of the ceasefire agreement between the military and the Kachin Independence Army, some individuals have been displaced multiple times, of course, impacting women and children more. Last year, a Baptist mission school and a Roman Catholic church, both in the Kachin state, were damaged by military gunfire and explosives. At one point last year, the military blocked humanitarian aid, held civilians hostage in their villages, and blocked journalists from entering the conflict zone. And in recent years, more than 30 churches have been destroyed in the Kachin state alone by heavy weapon attacks. And by some estimates, there are over 100 churches in the Kachin area that are no longer usable. And the Kachin Baptist Convention has been kind of the base of support for the entire state. Reports from the Chin state indicate that Burma's military forcibly recruits local villagers and internally displaced people to transport supplies and work for them. Ethnic armed organizations are also not blameless in these conflict areas. In 2018, the China-backed United Wa State Army that's also fighting the Burma military forces, targeted religious institutions and leaders in the northern Shan state. And, this is all under the guise of rooting out religious extremism, particularly among missionaries. It's soldiers interrogated and detained, clergy closed religious schools, destroyed unauthorized churches, banning new church construction, and forcibly, forcing them to join their military ranks. The military actually held 100 ethnic Wa Christians hostage, and they were just released at the end of last year. The physical devastation of war is more visible, but it's the human stories of conflict that is truly heartbreaking. For example, as the conflicts have raged on for decades, peace and interfaith activists have regularly been targeted. Late last year, A court sentenced 3 Kachin Christian activists to 6 months in prison for allegedly defaming the military, so that's a crime. While peacefully protesting the military's actions earlier in the year, trapping civilians, many of them Christians in a conflict zone, and cutting them off from humanitarian assistance. One was released last March and another just recently in April. As part of USERV's Religious Prisoner of Conscience project, former Commissioner Daniel Mark had adopted 2 Muslim interfaith peace activists to highlight their case and activate for their release. And they were just released in 2017, but they were literally arrested because what they did is they went to meet the Kachin Independence Army, delivered a Christian cross and a statue of Buddha as a sign of peace. And the government accused them of conspiring against the government and giving them 2-year sentences. And also the story of the 2 Baptist Kachin leaders, Dumdag Nad Lat and Longja Gensi, both members of the Kachin Baptist Convention, spent 15 months in prison for helping to expose the effects of war on local Christian communities. The authorities apprehended the men in 2016 after they assisted local journalists with military and strike information. The military alleged that both men supported the Kachin Independence Army, a false allegation that landed them both in prison for revealing the truth about the military's indiscriminate attacks on civilians and people of faith. Both were released just this last April. There were also a very well-known story in Kachin where 2 Kachin Baptist women were ethnic Wall Christians hostage, and they were just released at the end of last year. The physical devastation of war is more visible, but it's the human stories of conflict that is truly heartbreaking. For example, as the conflicts have raged on for decades, peace and interfaith activists have regularly been targeted. Late last year, a court sentenced 3 Kachin Christian activists to 6 months in prison for allegedly defaming the military, so that's a crime. While peacefully protesting the military's actions earlier in the year, trapping civilians, many of them Christians in a conflict zone, and cutting them off from humanitarian assistance. One was released last March and another just recently in April. As part of USERV's Religious Prisoner of Conscience project, former Commissioner Daniel Mark had adopted 2 Muslim interfaith peace activists to highlight their case and activate for their release. And they were just released in 2017, but they were literally arrested because what they did is they went to meet the Kachin Independence Army, delivered a Christian cross and a statue of Buddha as a sign of peace. And the government accused them of conspiring against the government and giving them 2-year sentences. And also the story of the 2 Baptist Kachin leaders, Dumdag Nad Lat and Longja Gensi, both members of the Kachin Baptist Convention, spent 15 months in prison for helping to expose the effects of war on local Christian communities. The authorities apprehended the men in 2016 after they assisted local journalists with military and strike information. The military alleged that both men supported the Kachin Independence Army, a false allegation that landed them both in prison for revealing the truth about the military's indiscriminate attacks on civilians and people of faith. Both were released just this last April. There were also a very well-known story in Kachin where 2 Kachin Baptist women were raped and murdered in January of 2015, while serving as volunteers in the school in northern Shan State. Their case remains unsolved, although there's lots of witnesses that say that there was the military that was involved in that crime. The non-ethnic areas in Burma also have struggled with Buddhist hate speech inciting violence, the government enforcing ridiculously strict anti-defamation laws, and now it appears that Aung San Suu Kyi is not, the head of the civilian government, is not tolerating criticism or dissent well. There's so much more about Burma. I just I sped through it real quick that I could go in, but really, the point that we saw was that the worst atrocities are in the area where there are armed conflicts, in the religious areas where there are armed conflicts. The Commission has recommended again that Burma be designated as a country of particular concern with the State Department for their systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. And I really thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is the Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett. He serves as a Senior Fellow and Director of the North American Action Team of the Religious Freedom Institute. He is also a Senior Fellow at Cardus, Canada's faith-based think tank where he is Program Director of Cardis Law, which looks at the role of law in society with a particular focus on religious freedom in Canada. Please join us in welcoming Father Henry.
Thanks very much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I want to focus on the situation in Ukraine. Cole has already referenced a bit. I'm also a Ukrainian Greek Catholic deacon, so full disclosure there, not simply a Harry Potter impersonator. So a little bit of background on the conflict first, and then the impact it's had on freedom of religion. But I don't want to focus only on the negative impacts that this tragic situation has had on religious freedom. I also want to highlight some rather surprising positive impacts. The current conflict that embroils Russia and Ukraine is one which has brought untold suffering in Ukraine's Donbas region and in the Russian-annexed Crimean Peninsula. It's also, I would say, brought into sharp focus the existential reality of Ukraine in terms of its sovereignty, its political stability, its economy, and I would say, in a way that perhaps, unlike any other European conflict since the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, it is a conflict that has had a direct impact on the religious character of the country and on the religious practice of its people. And we heard from Pastor Arnold about Cain and Abel, that famous story of brother against brother. That is the Russian and Ukrainian conflict in a nutshell. These are Orthodox Christians that have their roots in the establishment of a Christian civilization at Kiev and Rus in 988 that are fighting one another. So it's particularly tragic in that there's a fratricidal element to it. According to the Council of Foreign Relations, since the beginning of the Russian incursion into the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine in April 2014, the conflict between the Ukrainian army and Russian-backed separatists, let's bear in mind, this is not a civil war. This is about the Ukrainian army defending its territory from Russian incursion. It's about Russian aggression. The Russian-backed separatists, this conflict has led to some 10,300 deaths, 24,000 injured. In addition, it's estimated that 1.5 million Ukrainian civilians are now internally displaced within Ukraine, having been forced out of that region in eastern Ukraine. And again, these figures have resulted from Ukrainian forces fighting a defensive campaign wholly within Ukraine's sovereign territory against an external aggressor and its proxies within eastern Ukraine. The 4-year-long conflict has brought with it a deterioration in the religious freedom of Ukrainians living in Crimea and in the Donbas. The illegal Russian annexation of Crimea was soon accompanied by vandalism, intimidation, and suppression by the occupying authorities against what was then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate and its clergy, along with the clergy of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Russian restrictions on all religious groups other than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate rendered the Ukrainian Orthodox Church at that time of the Kiev Patriarchate and Greek Catholic leaders essentially as strangers in their own land. Similarly, Crimean Tatars, Tatar Muslims, were met with attacks and the forced dissolution of their legitimate representative body, the Mejlis, and the exile of their leaders. This is something that USCIRF has documented quite extensively. In its 2018 report on religious freedom in Russia, USCIRF details that in the Donbas, the early days of occupation brought with them kidnappings, torture, and robberies of members of non-Moscow Patriarchate religious communities. Russian-backed insurgents seized and continue to hold more than 50 church buildings belonging to the, at that time, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kiev Patriarchate, now the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. In the present conflict, those members of minority religious communities remaining in occupied areas, in particular Baptists, Pentecostals, Greek Catholics, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, are subject to regular intimidation, arrest, fines, and are subject to official slander for their beliefs. the insurgents that are in control of the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics evince a very deep suspicion of all those who are not members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. It's a very dire situation. I won't get into all the various types of violations of religious freedom. You can read USCIRF's reports. You can look also at the State Department report on religious freedom and the country profile on Ukraine and also Russia. So it's a very grave situation. But in the time that I have remaining, I want to focus on two positive developments, one great, one small, that have emerged out of this situation. War is never good. Even in situations of just war, there's grave suffering. But in this situation we have in Ukraine, in the midst of such a period of instability, a significant historical development has emerged, which betokens, I would say, a healing within the Ukrainian nation, a healing within the churches of Kiev and Rus that converted to Christianity back in 988. If we look back to the days of the Maidan Revolution in early 2014, a revolution that has been christened in Ukrainian as the Revoluция Hidnosti, so the revolution of dignity, we might say the revolution of human dignity. It was characterized above all by almost continual public prayer, led by the majority of Ukraine's faith communities. And there's a very broad diversity of faith communities in Ukraine. I'll come back to that in a minute. This strong religious character of Ukraine has been present throughout the conflict. In the face of Russian aggression and the explicit support of the Moscow Patriarchate for Russian actions, the Ukrainian Orthodox faithful and clergy have been exercising a degree of ecclesial choice that Cole referenced, and freedom not seen since the 1990s. Many have been leaving the Moscow Patriarchate Ukrainian Orthodox Church and moved towards what is now the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is a union of the previous Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kievan Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. You think Protestantism in the United States is complex? Well, come to Ukraine. Jurisdictional disputes are legendary. The granting of canonical status to these two churches that came together in October 2018 by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, Patriarch Bartholomew, who enjoys a primatial status amongst Orthodox, helped to resolve this matter. His action responded to the wishes of those Orthodox faithful and clergy in Ukraine who sought a legitimate home outside of the Moscow Patriarchate. The much heralded unification of these two churches in December 2018 into this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the first truly national autocephalous independent Orthodox Church, has healed a fracture within that Church of Kiev and Rus. And we should be happy about this, because there's an element of choice. These people want to be in this united church. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine can emerge as a strong unifying force in Ukraine. And again, I'm not of that church, so I'm not, I don't have a special bias here, but I do think it's an important development. Ukraine, unlike Russia, has always embraced a greater religious pluralism with many different churches, Protestant ecclesial communities and non-Christian communities, especially the now revived Jewish community in cities like Kyiv and Lviv. Indeed, if we use the Donetsk region alone as an example, at the beginning of 2014, before the Russian occupation, there were almost 1,800 different religious organizations in the Donetsk region, 762 Orthodox parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate, 366 evangelical Christian communities, Pentecostals, Charismatics, 186 Baptist churches, 86 Orthodox parishes of the Kievan Patriarchate, 83 Jehovah's Witnesses organizations, 49 Seventh-day Adventist churches, 38 Muslim communities, 36 Greek Catholic parishes, 19 Jewish communities, 14 Buddhist communities, and even 8 Krishna followers communities, just in one region of eastern Ukraine. This, I think, is important to remark upon, and I think we should be supporting Ukraine during this period to encourage that robust denominationalism. Ukraine's multiple ecclesial bodies, churches, and faiths is a great strength and reveals, again, I think this robust pluralism is something that must be supported. But the Ukrainian state has a duty in terms of recognizing religious freedom and supporting it, and there have been some worrying signs around the state trying to control this. to advance certain agendas, and we need to call them to account for that. Finally, a surprising small development in this period of conflict. As the Ukrainian armed forces began to set up small camps outside of villages in the Donbass region to fight the Russian insurgency, they built these very small field chapels, about a third of which were sort of dug out from the ground, and then a small dome, little tiny Byzantine church put over top. And these were typically churches that were administered by the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, or now the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And they kept them away from villages so the villages wouldn't be a target. But what they found in many villages in eastern Ukraine, where often they hadn't had a priest in a church there for years, the faithful from those villages found out about these small chapels and came out to them, despite the risk, to receive the sacraments. Some of them hadn't been able to go to confession for 3 years. Some of them hadn't been able to receive the Eucharist in over a year or 2 years. And these little field chapels became field spiritual hospitals for these faithful people and allowed them to exercise their religious freedom in the midst of this conflict. So conflict causes great harm, as we know, but there can also be these little green shoots of hope and expressions of religious freedom that can also result. Thank you very much for your time.
And last but not least, we have Christina Arriaga. She has worked on the defense of religious freedom or belief in the United States and internationally for over 20 years as an advisor to the United States delegation to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, an appointee to the Civil Rights Commission, and the executive director of a U.S.-based public interest law firm that defends all religious traditions. Please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you very much. I would also like to thank those who said a little prayer as I went behind Cole, that I wouldn't fall behind the stage. It was a very scary moment for me. Thank you very much to the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy and the Bruderhof, not only for hosting this event, but for being ahead of its time. After a 3-day historical gathering, you managed to have these tremendous intellectual worldwide powerhouses discuss what happens to religious sites, and now I'm very honored to sit with experts on the topic of religious freedom. But I also like to thank you for making us think about this topic. Not much has been written about warfare and its impact on religious freedom. And war, as we think about it, most people would assume conventional war, but as Cole has indicated, there are many kinds of war. And as Nadine brilliantly explained, for instance, in Burma, there was an erosion of rights and respect for religious freedom before there was a breakout of war. So again, thank you for having us think about these topics. As you all know, the ministerial just ended yesterday. It was the largest religious freedom gathering in the world, and in fact in history. I'm sure there'll be some numbers put out, but my understanding there were 106 countries participating, and 31 of them, I'm told by Kelly Boyle, who's here, the communications director at the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, 31 of them signed a resolution to protect religious sites. And that is great news, particularly given the recent terrorist attacks on several religious sites around the world. I'd like to turn my attention briefly to the tragedy of war in Iraq because of its worldwide repercussions for Christians around the world and specifically for that region. I'm sure you know, I know there are some theologians in the crowd, and I hope that we can have an interesting discussion about this later. But as you know, after Palestine and Israel, Iraq has the most biblical history in the world. Adam and Eve are widely thought to have lived in southern Iraq, and the Christians in Iraq are considered to be one of the oldest continuous communities in the world. In fact, the majority of Iraqi Christians are indigenous Eastern Aramaic-speaking ethnic Iraqi Assyrians. That's a mouthful, but most historians agree that Jesus spoke a dialect of Aramaic, so it's very probable that some of these original Christian communities in Iraq speak a similar dialect to the one that Jesus spoke when he walked on earth. The patriarch Abraham was from Uruk in southern Iraq. Rebecca was from northwest Iraq. Jacob's sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, they were all born in Iraq. And I can continue to give you examples, and I would encourage you to look at the fascinating history in Iraq, but the bottom line is before Islam, when Iraq was Mesopotamia, most of that region was Christian or Jewish. So this is a place where Christianity was essentially born, aside from Israel. So what happens when you have this war? And again, like Nadine explained in Burma, Iraq went through several stages of war, some conventional, some unconventional wars. The war happens in Iraq, and at the time there were apparently about 1.5 to 2 million Christians. We don't know for sure because there hasn't been a census in over 30 years. Today, there are 120,000 Christians left in Iraq. 120,000 Christians. And why is that important? I mean, it's important for Christians, but also because religious minorities test a country's tolerance for pluralism. And a healthy liberal democracy protects vulnerable groups and allows them to participate freely in society. So the presence of Christians in Iraq is a litmus test for the entire region, and I would argue for the world. Iraq is in a bad neighborhood. You have Iran right next to it, you have Syria, you have Turkey, you have a lot of countries that will either follow the lead of Iraq in terms of establishing pluralism or not. I was in Iraq last year, and the communities with which I met, the Yazidi communities, Turkmen, Christians, were all delighted that the United States government had decided to assist them and had a series of legislative projects to ensure that they were receiving funding. The vice president himself made several announcements about this, and the communities have been getting some assistance. However, we have another kind of warfare right now, and that is bad governance from Baghdad. Bad governance is a form of warfare. Bad governance is a form of complicity. Baghdad has not been a good partner to this effort to protect minorities or in investing in genocide recovery. In fact, Baghdad has made the PMFs, the popular, we use acronyms so often in Washington, Popular Mobilized Forces, I forgot what he stands for, PMF. Popular Mobilized Forces. So in 2014, an imam came out and asked for the youth to join in fighting back ISIS. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of young people in Iraq joined these militias. These militias were not well organized, didn't have weapons, didn't have training, and Iran saw this as a great opportunity. So they came in with resources and training and came in and trained these PMFs. What happens? Now these PMFs, largely thugs, are in charge of minority communities in Iraq. And they have grown so big that they're bigger than the Iraq actual army. So the United States government has been, and other nations have been asking Baghdad to become a good partner in this and rein in the PMFs and make them part of their own army. Instead, the Iraqi government has made the PMF part of its own coalition by allowing them to function with impunity. Sadly, what this means is unless the United States and the international community steps in, we will allow the Iraqi government to finish what ISIS started. I know it's a shocking thing to say, but currently, the only hope for that region in the world is if Christians are able to go back to their communities and Yazidis are able to go back to their communities and live with security and with jobs and in economic prosperity. Baghdad must think that the world doesn't care, and when they run out of money, the IMF will give them loans. We cannot allow that to happen. I argued earlier this week at a talk at USAID that the government in Baghdad must be treated like an international pariah until they stop financing Iran-backed militias and support genocide recovery. This is crucial, and it needs to happen within the next few months. The only way minority communities are going to start in Iraq after a conventional war is to stop the war of bad governance in Iraq and ensure that Baghdad becomes a responsible partner to the Western countries which have given so much aid. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have about 10 or 11 minutes for a discussion here. And since we're in Washington, I figured maybe we'll start with a question about American foreign policy. It seems like there's, with coming off the ministerial, like there is a sort of perhaps a newfound zeal to protect religious minorities in the Middle East, particularly Christians. And so my question for you is, I mean, it seems like a lot of these problems in Iraq, for example, were exacerbated or made significantly worse by American intervention in the war in Iraq. So I'm curious is there a recognition or an awareness that some of the problems that we're attempting to fix now were actually caused or created or exacerbated by our own foreign policy? And then the second component is there a tension between, let's say, the American government's strategy to promote religious liberty throughout the world and our foreign policy or national security strategy? To the extent that you're allowed or able to answer that, I'm curious.
Well, let me speak first. I remember going to Iraq in 2005. It's the only conference I've ever gone to in a bulletproof vest, which tells you something about the situation at the time. It was a little bit, I was working on the 2005 Constitution, which is probably better than it could have been, but worse. There are problems, as you know. And looking back, it's fairly clear that the U.S. made some serious mistakes in how they handled things, particularly after conquering Baghdad and so forth, by not allowing, by sending the military home to unemployment, and by sending the bureaucracy home to unemployment, you created a situation, and also letting all the sacred sites be raided and so forth. What might have been something workable collapsed, and has never been workable since. So that's my own sort of opinion, just having watched things unfolding on the ground. So the second question about whether religious liberty is consistent with foreign policy. One of my friends, former commission member, often used to say the U.S. leads by irritation. And I think one of the things that we've seen with the ministerial is the hand of, I'm sure it's more than one person, but I think of one person in particular who has really been a master at leading without irritation. And I'm convinced that religious freedom is good for U.S. foreign policy. Tom Parr next door has written a book about that. The one thing I would say is you have to be careful about how you relay that on, because it makes sense with Tom's audience, that is U.S. foreign policy experts. But if you say religious freedom is good for U.S. foreign policy to foreigners, they say, aha, that's what we always suspected, a hidden agenda, American interests, neo-colonialism, etc. Religious freedom is good for other countries because it reinforces good governance. It creates the seeds out of which peace can be crystallized. It, as we know from the what I call the Grimm statistics, because Brian Grimm was originally behind them. But they are grim about the level of restrictions on Earth and the increasing level of restrictions. What we also know is that religious freedom correlates with all kinds of other social goods. And while it's hard to do the social science to translate these correlations into causation, I deeply believe that there are alignments, and that the greatest hope for dealing with conflict on Earth, for moving from Hobbesian war to genuine peace, is religious freedom. Whatever else happens, the only alternative is warfare. We have to have religious freedom, or we cannot have justice and peace.
I think just as the only non-American up here, as a Canadian, and as someone who served in the diplomatic corps, leading efforts on religious freedom from the Canadian perspective, I'm not going to comment on U.S. foreign policy, but I think one thing we can say about this, the tension that exists within foreign policy between promoting human rights such as religious freedom and then promoting certain interests. Typically we have diplomats and foreign policy actors that have a good understanding of a lot of different human rights, but often very little understanding of religious freedom, and often an even worse understanding of faith. Because the process of formation we have in our countries, whether that's Canada or the US or the United Kingdom, is that from secondary school through to postgraduate school, there's very little discussion of religion or faith. And Madeleine Albright has been very famous for talking about how she really didn't have anybody in the State Department who could advise her on religion. And the bottom line is that foreign policy actors have to get religion. And I don't mean that in the folksy way. I mean they have to be able to understand religion not simply by what do Muslims believe, what do Christians believe, but why do religious people act as they do? How does faith inform their actions? Not simply cultural actions, but also how does faith inform their political judgment, their social economic activities, and we can't understand that unless when we engage in foreign policy we're well trained. And so I think, again, diplomatic training is essential, not simply on religious freedom, but on the role of faith and why faith is important. We come from very secular societies, but we're really the outliers when it comes to the rest of the world.
I think it's really a matter of priorities. I think it's really easy at the ministerial for us to, talk about the priority of religious freedom, and then there's an emergency in the world and we need an ally to do something for us. And they commit egregious violations of religious freedom, but yet we need them to do something for us. And so maybe that bill in Congress that, calls them out on something shouldn't go through, or maybe, so that's the frustration of all of this is how hard it is to implement and to prioritize. And I think thinking about the ministerial, it's we used to whisper about religious freedom, and now we talk openly and yell about it and have conversations, and governments come and listen to us talk about it, and they talk, so it's not this hidden thing anymore, which is just magnificent, but it's still a matter of priorities, and that's why, we have to just keep going forward and pushing and figuring out where the levers are that we could make this a priority, and that it isn't left off the table when we're negotiating with a major country about trade. Whatever, that it's always a piece of the equation, at least it's a piece of the equation. Obviously, we'd like it to be a priority piece of the equation, but a piece of the equation. I think that's part of the reason they created USERP, so there would always be this ringing bell somewhere that would make it so it would be hard to
Christy, yeah, feel free. And I'll tag on another question for you as well.
Oh, yes.
You spoke at this conference with the committee here last year, so I'm also wondering if there's any areas in the world where you feel progress has been made on the issue of religious freedom since we last met. So, both questions for you.
Okay, so just 12 months ago, the only country in the world that had a U.S. ambassador large for religious freedom, he was the one in Canada, briefly, the only country in the world that had a person dedicated at State Department to religious freedom was the United States. And in the last 12 months, I think now there are 13 envoys, special envoys for religious freedom. I think that the fact that every single foreign minister that participated in this conference, 106 countries, had to be briefed by someone within its foreign ministry about religious freedom issues. Every single cable from every single embassy in 198 countries has to include considerations of religious freedom. So that alone, I think, makes it a huge progress. In terms of specific countries, it's hard to say, right? One can argue the Saudis made a few statements, and then it's 3 steps forward, sometimes 2 back or 4 back in several countries. So without having a big survey, it would be hard to discuss specific countries, but I'm an optimist. I think that the idea that we can have robust conversations about these issues without anyone saying what you're saying is offensive or what you're saying is blasphemy, it's a huge advantage to the world. And back to the American question, I could give you a list of a good 10 mistakes that the United States government made in terms of its policy towards Iraq. But I can also tell you that before the United States came in, there was a ruthless, murderous dictator in charge of the country for many years. I can also tell you that we're sitting in the Museum of the Bible, which would be legal in the vast majority of countries that USERV covers and the Department of State covers. The fact that we're having this discussion without fearing getting arrested on the way out is really miraculous. Few Americans think about this in terms of their own life. Most Americans don't understand that what we're doing here is illegal. The fact that he's wearing a cassock is illegal in many of the countries that we're looking at, including places like Mexico. I'm not just talking like the faraway countries. And Quebec, I didn't want to say it because you're here, and the thing is you can kick me under the table, so I moved my feet away as soon as you said Quebec. The biggest danger to religious freedom right now is the government intrusion into people's lives, encased in the idea of this is for security reasons, or you should not offend anyone, these blasphemy laws. And in the United States, the idea that if what you say is offends me in any way, you cannot say it, and therefore we cannot have a discussion about it. We're raising a generation of people who live in their own minds. Yeah, to quote Anne Lamott, my mind is a place, it's like a bad neighborhood where I would rather not be alone. So in the Western world, thank you. In the Western world, we have to be ahead, and that's why these discussions are so important, and challenge our youth and our students to think about these issues seriously, to think about what is truth, not what is my truth, what is my faith, what is faith, what is truth, how does, like it or not, we're a superpower. Darn if you do, darn if you don't. So, thank you.
Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
Faith will win, and freedom will win. And when it's the darkest, then the light shines the brightest. So keep on going, everybody.
And one more question, because our time is just about up. In terms of, we've talked about policy, but in terms of engaging our own religious or church communities with these issues, do you have any recommendations, or what have you perhaps found at the Bruderhof to be successful?
Save the hardest question for last. Recommendations. I think keep coming together. We need to discuss these issues. It was very enlightening to hear what you all had to say, and there's a lot happening. And so I think the more people come together, talk about these issues, and make little steps forward in our neighborhoods, we act locally and think globally.
I think one thing that's really fair and obvious is that work in this area of religious freedom has to be done with others. If you go at it alone, it's special pleading. If you go at it with others, it's principled and deserves respect and wins respect. So I think we need to continue finding more ways such as this to bring people together, people who may disagree theologically, but who understand the existential significance of freedom and religious freedom, and that peace comes, we don't need to be homogeneous to have peace. What we need is confidence that other people will respect us and our dignity just as we respect theirs.
Any last words?
Just on the question of sort of domestic religious freedom, we have to have robust religious freedom at home if we're going to presume to comment on religious freedom overseas. And I think all of us that work in this area are well acquainted with that principle. But we have to remember too, as we engage our own faith communities, whether it's in the US or Canada, wherever, to remind people and almost represent to them what religious freedom is. Religious freedom is about public faith. We're always free in the forum interna. We're always free in our inner life of faith. The Holy Apostle Paul, the Holy Apostle Peter were in prison at various times. They were no less free. So we need to re-engage people and say that religious freedom is about publicly living out your faith. If we don't do that, if we don't exercise the responsibility attached to religious freedom, then it begins to become impoverished. And we forget how to live it out, and therefore, down the road, we forget how to engage others. It goes back to my previous comment on training our professionals. So remember to live out a robust religious freedom at home so we can engage others to help them overseas.
Thank you.
I was going to say we're in a society where, you know, the red meat issues gets the headlines, gets the hits, gets the questions, gets the social media posts in a thoughtful post. I mean, we've all been there, right, on social media where you post something thoughtful and no one likes it, where, you know, something else that was a little, you know, everyone was engaged. And so I think we just have to be proactive, because religious freedom can be cast in a negative red meat kind of way by the media or by the people that are using it for their whatever advantage that gives them, where what we need to be having is thoughtful conversations, because so many of Americans don't think about international religious freedom at all. It just doesn't show up in their news feeds. It doesn't, it's not a part of their community of the way they talk. And I think being intentional with things like this, being intentional in how we communicate in order to raise awareness, because what we need is awareness, so that, like Senator Santorum said, the Congress will care, put pressure. You know, if we're doing this on our own in an echo chamber, we're not going to see the kind of results we could see if we were engaging a broader part of our community.
Last one. All politics are local. All politics are local. So talking to your priest, your rabbi, the leader of your community about these issues, and the mind is not a logic processor, it's a story processor. So telling the stories of why this is important. I saw Pastor Chin here earlier. His wife was tortured because she met with David Saperstein, and now he is free from Vietnam and here in the United States. So there's people all around us where we should be telling the stories and illustrating what the dangers are for this country. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Let's give another round of applause for our panel.